Welcome to the Relationships Decoding Podcast.
All right, so we're diving into some stuff you sent our way, and it's all about this thing called a scarcity mindset. And yeah, and it's interesting because at first I thought, oh, this is going to be about, like not having enough stuff, like just, materially, but it's really not. It's more about this like deep down feeling like, I am not enough somehow. And then because of that, you get into this whole I can't do it loop.
Yeah.
And then you end up feeling even more powerless. So it's like this,
It's cycle.
Yeah, this cycle you can't escape.
Absolutely. It's funny because, it's one of those things that it really highlights that it's not about what's objectively true. It's not about looking at your bank account and saying, oh, I don't have enough money, therefore I have a scarcity mindset, or I don't have enough clothes in my closet, or whatever whatever the metric is that people are using it really is this internal state.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, what's so important to understand.
Exactly. And I think that's what we really want to explore in this deep dive is like, where does this feeling even come from? And maybe even more importantly, is there anything in this material you gave us that gives us a clue about how to break out of it?
Yeah.
Because it just seems like this, this feeling of powerlessness and then the scarcity mindset itself.
Yeah.
This feed each other.
They're totally interconnected. Yeah. That's exactly what a lot of these sources really highlight, is this two-way street, that it's not just one thing causing the other, it's that they are constantly both, feeding into each other.
And one thing that really struck me early on was this idea that scarcity isn't always about what you don't have.
Yeah.
It's not like this objective, it feels like this mental habit we've learned.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you can have a lot of things and still feel like you don't have enough.
That's such a key insight, and some of your sources really highlight how you have people who are in extremely favorable conditions and yet still grapple with this immense sense of lack.
Right.
And then you have other who might be, really dealing with hardship,
right,
who are actually able to cultivate the sense of enoughness. And I think that right there tells us so much about how the scarcity mindset is really, this internal pattern. It's not solely dictated by our external circumstances.
So let's dig into the why behind all of this. Why this feeling of lack, persists.
Yeah. Your
material kind of points to a few important areas. But one of the first things that jumped out at me was this idea of habitual thinking. Like it's not just our surroundings, it's how we're processing it all internally.
Yeah, it's like our default setting almost.
Right.
Like we're just constantly looking for what's missing and what we don't have, as opposed to appreciating, what we do have. And I think that's something that, is highlighted a lot in the materials.
And speaking of looking inward, childhood experiences seem to play a huge role.
Oh, absolutely.
In kind of setting the stage for all of this, especially this idea of conditional self-worth. Can you unpack that a little bit?
I think one of the takeaways here is that so much of how we view ourselves is really shaped by those early childhood experiences, and particularly this idea that, if we were in environments where we felt like love or approval was conditional,
right,
like it was something we had to earn through, specific actions or achievements, that can really lead to this deep-seated belief that I am not good enough, therefore I am not worthy.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly seeking this external validation because we don't have that, solid internal sense of self-worth. And what's so interesting is, a lot of these sources talk about how this can really persist into adulthood, even when we achieve incredible things. It's when we, check all the boxes and we're doing all the things that we thought would make us feel worthy, we still have this lingering feeling of inadequacy.
Right. It's like you're constantly trying to fill this void of enoughness, but the target just keeps moving.
The goalposts keep shifting. Exactly.
Exactly. You never quite get there.
Right.
And your sources also talked about cognitive biases, like the way our minds tend to focus on what's missing. Like almost like our brains are wired to spot the gaps.
Yes. And this is so powerful. And I think, one of the things that is particularly relevant today is this idea of social comparison.
Oh, yeah.
Where, we are constantly bombarded with these, very curated, often, filtered images of other people's lives.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to fall into the trap of comparing our messy behind the scenes
Right.
reality with their highlight reel.
Yeah.
And that can really fuel this sense of inadequacy and scarcity.
It's like we're constantly scrolling through everyone else's highlight reel and comparing it to our blooper reel.
Exactly.
And then there's this once I achieve X trap.
Mm-hmm.
The material talked about how we set these goals, thinking, okay, once I reach that, once I get that promotion, once I, buy that house, whatever it is,
Yeah.
then I'll finally feel content. But then the feeling of lack just kind of finds its way back in.
Yes, I think what this shows us is that there's this disconnect between our external achievements and our internal state.
Mm.
And it really emphasizes that, just because we achieve something
Right.
doesn't mean that that underlying, feeling of not enough is going to magically disappear.
Yeah, it's almost like this feeling of not enough is separate from what we actually achieve. So you can achieve all these things and still feel that way.
Absolutely. And I think it's almost like it's a treadmill.
Yeah.
Where, we're constantly, striving and running and
Right.
achieving, but we're not actually getting anywhere in terms of that internal sense of, self-worth or contentment.
And it's not just our own psychology at play, right?
Right.
Your sources also talked about this larger social and cultural environment that we're in. That really kind of reinforces this never enough mentality.
Oh, yeah.
Things like consumerism, the competitive culture.
Absolutely.
Like we're kind of swimming in this.
I think when we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it becomes very clear that, the systems and structures
Right.
that we live in absolutely play a role in perpetuating this scarcity mindset.
Yeah.
You mentioned consumerism, which is,
Yeah.
Inherently designed to keep us wanting more,
Right.
to keep us feeling like we need the next thing
Yeah.
in order to be happy or complete. And then, the competitive nature of, many modern societies
Right.
really pushes us to, tie our self-worth to these external markers of success.
Yeah.
Which, can often come at the expense of our inner peace and genuine fulfillment.
It's like this endless chase for more
Mm-hmm.
stuff, more achievements, just to kind of feel like we measure up.
Yeah, and it's exhausting.
And it's exhausting.
Yeah, it's really unsustainable.
Yeah, and your sources even talked about the biological factors at play.
It's like something about dopamine and how our bodies respond to stress.
Right, and I think that's really fascinating is that, there's this biological underpinning
Yeah.
to this tendency that, our brains are wired to seek out novelty and reward. And so, the dopamine system is constantly, pushing us towards wanting more, seeking more, as opposed to appreciating what we have. And then, chronic stress, which so many of us experience today, can actually keep our brains in this state of, hypervigilance and perceived lack. So we're almost, in this scarcity mode as a default setting.
So it really does seem like this feeling of scarcity is more of a learned way of thinking, shaped by our past, by the thoughts we're thinking now,
Yeah,
by society, and not necessarily just a reflection of what we actually lack.
absolutely. And I think that's actually quite empowering.
Yeah.
Because if it's a learned habit, it means that we can potentially unlearn it or at least, reshape it significantly. Absolutely. Now, your sources also went into this really interesting connection between feeling powerless and having that scarcity mindset. It's not just that we feel like we don't have enough things.
Right.
It's that lack makes us feel like we're powerless to actually change anything.
Right.
And then the powerlessness makes that scarcity feel even more intense.
Exactly.
So it's like this really nasty cycle.
It is. And the material does a really nice job of, describing this relationship.
Yeah.
It's this, feedback loop where they're both feeding each other.
Yeah.
So, it's helpful to break it down and look at first how scarcity can lead to that feeling of powerlessness.
Okay, so how does that work? How does feeling like you lack something turn into the sense of I can't do anything about it?
Well, one of the things that your sources talk about is that when we feel a fundamental lack of security, whether that's emotional security, financial security, that can make it very difficult to trust, the world around us, our place in it.
Yeah.
And that lack of trust can really breed feelings of helplessness. If we don't feel safe and secure.
Right.
It's hard to feel like we can actually take effective action.
Yeah.
Similarly, if we feel a lack of belonging, we might become overly reliant on external approval for our sense of worth. And so we feel powerless to actually define our own value. And then I think perhaps most significantly, that deep-seated feeling of not being good enough
Right.
can lead to this belief of, I can't change my situation.
Yeah.
And that belief really erodes our motivation, our sense of agency. And, one of the analogies that's used is this idea of having this like internal resources tank that's constantly half empty. And so we're always operating from this place of depletion.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, and it's hard to take action when you
Yeah.
feel like you're already running on fumes.
Yeah, that really resonates, like trying to run a marathon, but you're already exhausted
Exactly.
before you even start. And then the other side of that is how that scarcity itself makes us believe we're somehow inadequate.
Right.
Like, it's not just about not having things, it's about how we see ourselves.
Yeah, it becomes this, internalized identity almost. And so, for example, if we experience emotional scarcity,
Right.
so a lack of love connection, that can lead to this belief that we're unworthy of affection.
Right.
And then we might, sabotage relationships or push people away
Yeah.
because we don't feel like we deserve that love.
Right.
And then, achievement scarcity, that constant feeling of never measuring up,
Right.
can lead to a fear of even trying new things because we anticipate failure.
Yeah.
And then security scarcity, can make us see the world
Right.
as a dangerous and threatening place,
Yeah.
leading to all sorts of, avoidance behaviors
Right.
as a way to try to protect ourselves. And so, the key outcome here is often inaction. We feel inadequate, and so we don't even make the attempt. And then that avoidance just further erodes our confidence.
Right. So it's like a double whammy feeling like you don't have enough, makes you feel powerless. And then that powerlessness just reinforces the idea that you are inadequate.
Yeah, you're not capable.
Yeah.
And so it's this really, tight knot to untangle.
And then your sources go on to explain how this powerlessness can actually amplify the scarcity even further.
Yes, this is where it becomes this, really self-perpetuating cycle.
Right.
So when we feel powerless
Right.
and we believe that, our efforts aren't going to make a difference, that leads to a lack of motivation.
Right.
We just stop trying.
We give up.
Yeah. And when we
Right.
don't try, that then leads to this, reduced self-efficacy, which is this belief
Right.
in our own ability to succeed. And so, if we're not trying new things because we're convinced that change is impossible,
Right.
we never get the opportunity to prove ourselves wrong.
Right.
And then, this is often compounded by negative self-reinforcement, where we start to accept these limiting beliefs about ourselves.
Yeah.
This is just the way I am. I'm not good at that. I can't do that. And so we create this
Right.
self-fulfilling prophecy where our lack of belief in ourselves actually prevents us
Right.
from taking the actions that could lead to, improvement.
It's like this loop of I'm not good enough, so I won't try. And because I don't try, I never get better.
Right. And it just reinforces that initial belief.
Exactly. And it just goes round and round. So it
Yeah.
sounds incredibly hard to break free.
It is a challenge. But the good news is that,
Yeah.
your sources point out that overcoming scarcity, it's not about this, magical elimination of the feeling altogether. It's not about constantly, trying to fill this bottomless pit. It's more about learning
Yeah.
to shift our mindset and rebuild our inner strength.
So let's talk about ways to break free.
Okay.
One of the first things your material mentioned was redefining what it means to have enough. And that's not about like a specific number
Right.
or amount, right? It's more of a shift in how we're seeing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And your sources really emphasize the importance of, actively training our minds
Yeah.
to
Should.
notice and appreciate what we already have. And so, one of the practices that's often recommended is its idea of gratitude.
Yeah.
So whether it's keeping a gratitude journal,
Right.
you write down, 3 things you're grateful for each day, or just taking a few moments to really, savor and appreciate the good things in your life.
Yeah.
It's really about, intentionally shifting our focus from what's missing to what's present.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the other thing that, is really important to highlight is this idea of comparison.
Oh, yeah.
So much of our perceived lack comes from, these comparisons we make with others.
Yeah.
And so by consciously, limiting that tendency to compare ourselves,
Right.
we can really reduce those feelings of inadequacy.
Comparison is the thief of joy, right?
It really is.
And then your sources also talk about the value of taking small, consistent actions. And this makes sense because when you're feeling powerless
Right.
and you're overwhelmed by this scarcity,
Yeah.
making massive changes feels impossible.
It feels insurmountable.
Yeah, but starting with small steps feels doable.
Absolutely. And I think the key here is to really build momentum and confidence
Right.
through actions that feel attainable.
Mm.
So whether it's, reading a page of a book
Yeah.
or completing a small task or just, trying something new but low pressure,
Right.
it's about giving ourselves these like small wins.
Mm.
That might seem insignificant on their own, but they really add up over time.
Yeah.
And they start to reinforce this belief that I can do it.
Right.
And they strengthen our resilience against those feelings of powerlessness.
It's like any skill you don't start with the hardest thing. You start with something you can manage and then slowly work your way up.
Exactly. You build that foundation.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of changing our relationship with scarcity. Like, it's not about pretending it doesn't exist, but more about how we choose to respond.
Yeah, this is so crucial. And I think, one of the things that your sources really encourage is this acceptance that feelings of scarcity are going to arise in our lives.
Right.
It's part of the human experience.
Yeah.
But the key is that we don't have to let them dictate our actions or define our worth.
Right.
It's about reframing our relationship with scarcity, recognizing it's there, but not giving it all the power.
Right.
And I think, one of the things that can be really helpful is to shift our focus, away from this solely pursuing possessions as a path to happiness and towards, finding fulfillment through meaningful experiences, through creativity, through connection with others.
Yeah.
True contentment often comes not from having everything,
Right.
but from appreciating, the richness of life as it is.
Absolutely. So it sounds like overcoming this cycle of scarcity and powerlessness. It's not about like some huge transformation overnight.
Yeah.
It's more of this gradual shift
Yeah.
in how we think, how we interact with the world.
It's a process.
Yeah, and about building that belief in ourselves, not based on external validation, but on what we've actually experienced, even if we still have that feeling of not enough underneath.
And I think it really comes down to courage. Having the courage to keep moving forward, despite those feelings, to take those small steps,
Right.
to actively participate in life. And in doing so, we gradually build that, genuine self-belief.
Yeah, it's like you're not waiting to feel good enough to do it.
Right.
You're doing it, and then the feeling follows.
Exactly. Action precedes motivation.
Yeah.
In this case.
So to kind of bring it all back together from all this amazing material you shared, we've really looked at this deep connection between scarcity and feeling powerless. This cycle, where feeling like you don't have enough leads to feeling like you can't.
Right.
And then that makes that feeling of not having enough even stronger.
And it just keeps going.
Yeah. And we looked at, where these feelings might come from childhood, societal pressures, even the way our brains are wired.
Yeah, all these different layers.
Yeah. And we talked about some practical things you can try. It's not about finding a quick fix, but about consciously, trying to notice what's already abundant in your life.
Yeah.
Taking small actions to build up some momentum and confidence. And ultimately rethinking that relationship with that feeling of not enough.
Right.
Recognizing that it doesn't have to be in control.
Exactly.
So a final thought for you to consider this week. Think about one area in your life where you've been feeling that sense of lack. It could be anything, time, money, connection, opportunity, whatever.
Right.
But instead of focusing on what you need to get in that area, what small, meaningful experience could you create for yourself this week? Maybe it's setting aside some time to connect with someone you care about. Maybe it's spending 15 minutes on a creative project you've been putting off.
Yeah.
Or just, taking a moment to really savor, a quiet moment in nature. Just consider how that little shift in focus from acquisition to experience might actually shift those feelings of scarcity.
That's a great point.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
Take care.
You too.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you next time.